Good afternoon, and thanks IFPRI for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming out for this presentation, which actually is a double presentation. I apologize for that in advance. I normally like to focus on one issue at a time, but besides talking about the state of food and agriculture 2015, I also want to talk to you about the state of food and agriculture in 2016. So I have one report that is already written, and I'll talk about most of that, but give you some flavor of what we're thinking of working on the State of Food and Agriculture 2016 report, which will be on climate change and agriculture. Also, was already mentioned, I'd like to thank IFPRI for their regular contributions to these flagship reports. So IFPRI is a bit accomplice in the conclusions that we found, but it's not just for this report, also for previous reports. Let me go directly into the topic, since I have the two issues to cover. First, maybe social protection, which is the core topic of the last year's report. Before the position I have currently, which I've just occupied a couple of weeks ago, I was the Director of Social Protection, and at that time it was like a very new topic to FAO, and I had a pretty hard time the first year to convince member states of FAO that social protection was a relevant thing to work on for the Food and Agriculture Organization. Not that member states were against social protection, but they said, well, why would FAO do with it? We have other organizations that look at it. It's not the Ministries of Agriculture responsibility. We have UNICEF, we have all kinds of other organizations, the ILO, that looks at these issues. But I guess the issue for FAO, it's not one key issue of social protection when we think of food security is, of course, how do you get access to food? And lack of income is typically one of the key features of that. And so if there's a lack of income, then social protection could be one way of solving that problem. But one of the key elements that we argued to the member states is, and that's what a lot of the report is about, is that social protection can also be a catalyst for agricultural development and a way for the rural poor to break out of poverty, because it may help manage their risks better, and that may help stimulate food production through farmers that can invest more into their future, and through that help food security and nutrition further down the road. So, and also for that reason, also the new development agenda is built around the Sustainable Development Goals. Social protection is mentioned on a number of occasions. There was a few years ago when I still had to struggle. Last year at FAO conference, this is the big meeting of all FAO member states, we had about 45 countries that reported on their progress in fighting hunger, and all of them emphasized social protection as one of the key elements that were part of the success. Now, just dwelling very quickly on why this is important, also why we look at not just from the food security perspective, but also from the rural poverty perspective, and why it's part of FAO's mandate. It's most of the extreme poor live in rural areas, and most of them are concentrated in Africa and South Asia, and a large part of those rural poor depend directly on agriculture, if not indirectly on agricultural incomes. So whatever happens in food production and how to translate into situation of food security, it's well in the areas of work of FAO. Here I show how important still the concentration of rural poor is. This is where we see in most regions that the share of poor in rural areas is much higher than in urban areas. Typically, when we define it through extreme poverty, the World Bank estimates about 78% of the world's poor live in rural areas. So that sketches a bit the context, and if we look at social protection programs, we've seen quite a bit of an expansion of social protection programs, particularly cash transfer programs become a very popular way of providing social protection to broad numbers of the world population. And we've seen an expansion of those programs and other forms of social assistance in recent years. But yet, particularly in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa again, it's almost 80% of the population has no access whatsoever to any form of social protection, be it social insurance or the social security programs, or pure social assistance programs like cash transfer programs, food distribution programs, and so on and so forth. So we still have a long way to go, even though we have seen this expansion. But the advantage of seeing this new developments and providing more social protection also gives a way to evaluate better what are the impacts and what benefits there can be from social protection. And that's basically what the report was about. Let me skip this slide and get to the heart of the matter straightforward. The findings in the report, which is built on some work done at FAO in a project we call good characterization, I think, is from protection to production. That's basically our view of it, so how social protection can catalyze the productive side and to make people stand on their own feet rather than seeing social protection as a pure handout. And part of it is based on a large number of studies that have been conducted, particularly of these new programs, the cash transfer programs in many developing countries. And IFPRI has been instrumental in making many of these impact assessments. So among the things we find is that social protection tends to help reduce directly poverty and food insecurity, the latter particularly by providing extra means to the household and through that more access to food. If we take example from a number of case studies in Sub-Saharan Africa, where we did these impact assessments through the from protection to production projects that we have, all these signs that you show here are positive impacts, even if they say minus sign, but it's something negative that is going down and hence is improving. So basically what we see in all these country cases, except for Kenya where we didn't have the same study conducted, that people do eat more meals, have better access to food, and have less probability that they have gone days without a meal or with less food in the meals they eat. And we found that there's a rather consistent pattern in each of these cases. We also find that the social protection has helped increase nutritional value of the diets people have, the quality of foods, and the diversity of what they eat. And here we see particularly with the help of social protection programs, with the extra income people get from social protection, that animal proteins go up where previously may have had no animal proteins to begin with, and that has helped diversify their food, but also positive impacts on cereals, in some cases also fruits, fats, and more in general dietary diversity. But also a few cases that it not always works with the same degree, particularly in these cases in Ghana and Lesotho, we didn't find strong, significant impacts of that sort, of which the reasons for which I'll explain in a minute. There's other things that social protection systems also observed, and a lot of the cash transfer programs as we know them now were invented in the late 1990s as a response to financial crises in a number of countries in Latin America where they've been very successful. Now that they are in place, we also find that as maybe a difference from the time when they were introduced, that have much bigger impacts because the systems were in place. And once a new crisis strikes, that there's something you can either enhance because of the crisis, or at least that the social protection is in place, rather than it's an afterthought in a response to a crisis, rather than seeing it also as a preventive action to increase the resilience of households against those shocks. Another important aspect of the social protection programs, as we see them recently, particularly cash transfer programs, very often they're directly handed, the benefits handed to women, and that tends to enhance these impacts, particularly on better access to food and nutrition. Some people would say women spend the money more wisely than men do and give more attention to basic needs than men do. But there's other reasons that go with it. Again, there's a bit of variation around that, but on the whole, we see very positive gender empowerment results from a lot of the social protection programs around the world. Now, importantly also, several of the programs have the important impacts of human capital development through the nutrition effect, food access to food effect, but also the programs that are conditioned to keep children in school or attend health centers tends to relate directly to human investments, whereas maybe otherwise during shocks families would take their children from school or stop going to the health centers with long-term effects on human development. So part of the reasons why some of these cash transfer programs have been conditioned to those, to sending children to school, for instance, were for those reasons to prevent those long-term impacts. We see also strong positive effects in the risk management, and some examples of that, again, for the same set of countries, where people were asked, well, how did the social protection benefits change some of their behaviors. In some cases, help pay off their debts, and through that they could look more to the future. It enhanced savings, or it reduced their reliance on borrowing that might have created problems for them later on if they would have shocks in production, couldn't pay off their debts, and so on. And also, in many cases, it reduced reliance on informal transfers and remittances. I was going to add this to it. So on the whole, we see these positive effects on reducing negative risk management strategies into more positive ones. And in some cases also a key effect was the strengthening of social networks. By giving people again a belonging and not feeling too deprived because of shocks, they re-engaged in social lives, and that helped in many cases improve their livelihoods over the long run accordingly. Another impact which we also looked at in the report is did it help improve asset accumulation and investment strategies for farmers. Well, the first thing you see with a lot of the social protection programs, that it on the negative side, if you like, that where normally farmers would sell off a cow or a plow when a shock would come. Now they stop doing it, and hence you don't get the asset destruction at the household level that we saw before. But beyond that, because of better risk management and social protection helping risk management strategies, we've also found, again in the same countries, very strong effects on farmers buying more agricultural inputs, agricultural tools, and hence improving agricultural production, as well as having more ownership of livestock, which typically over the longer run also helps them build more resilience against shocks. But also on the production side, help them generate additional incomes. In some cases, particularly in Zambia, we also find very strong effects on farmers diversifying in non-farm activities, and have improved livelihoods that way. Again, as this table shows, in some of the countries, like in Ghana in particular, we didn't find those strong impacts. Again, I'll explain in a minute why we think that was one of the reasons why that was the case. I already mentioned the important positive impact on social networking and being part of social organizations, which in some cases the response we get from the surveys, it changed people's lives around, particularly for women, that through that become more engaged with their societies, and that in the very poor livelihoods is very important to improve moving forward. We also have a program on preventing child labor. We also see social protection having positive effects on reducing child labor. Child labor is a rampant problem in agriculture. 60% of child labor around the world takes place in agricultural sectors, in the broad sense, including crop production, livestock, and fisheries. Now, one thing which we also found is very strong multiplier effects of social protection programs on the local economy. Here's the president of Ghana, who cites basically results from the protection to production program, which basically found that for each dollar or each cedi spent on social protection to a beneficiary household, the local economy benefits 2.5 cedis, the local currency. So those are very strong multiplier effects, even though a lot of these benefits go to non-beneficiary households because the poor will spend more and typically spend a lot of it in the local economy, and as a result also non-beneficiary households can benefit, but that creates new dynamics in the local economy. So what's the upshot of the story? So social protection, we can see, can have very strong effects, not just to come back to the initial point and critique we received when FAO was engaging in this, saying you make people maybe dependent on social protection, and social protection should just be for avoiding people falling through the cracks. Basically what we're saying here is we can see, particularly at the bottom end of the scale, social protection helping people change their lives around and actually get back on their feet and invest in their future. But we do need, by itself it's not enough, we need complementary measures. Typically where it worked well in this graph, you see that the stronger effects also on crop and livestock and non-farm and enterprise development, strong effects were there because there were complementary measures that help effectuate that on top of social protection. Also, how you provide the social benefits seems to matter. In the case of Ghana, for instance, the benefits are very irregular, come in lumpy amounts, so bigger amounts at one go rather than smaller amounts spread over time, like in Zambia. And in Zambia, as I showed, the impacts, the positive impacts are much stronger than in the case of Ghana, which suggests that if you have regular, predictable transfers, that helps farmers manage their risks much better and give them the required income security. So we need to link them to agriculture programs, and that's where FAO then comes in, into seeing how can we link these social protection programs to other interventions that help lift the constraints of smallholder farmers, in particular the poor farmers, to improve their livelihoods and improve food security. And it then also helps that, for instance, the multiplier effects I talked about tend to get much stronger when farmers have better connections to markets, that the local economy effects become stronger, and that the constraints on their economic development are helped and lifted through these complementary interventions. And last but not least, by building greater resilience, social protection can also be part of the strategies to make great resilience against climate change shocks, which we already see around the world. And that's where I want to move to my next presentation. I'm not sure how much time I have left. Simply still going good, but like with social protection, is linked to our bread and butter interventions in improving agricultural productivity, and particularly help poor smallholder farmers lift their constraints, be it on the liquidity side, be it on the access to market side, is where social protection can provide a catalyst if other things fall into place. Okay, now moving to our next report, but climate change shocks and the implication of climate change can be much vaster and bigger than one could ever think of covering through the shocks from climate change. So if put up, this is, okay. The next presentation, so I'll be a bit shorter because this is a report that's yet to be written, but it's always good to have a discussion up front about it to see, well, what we think should be the key messages and see how that falls into place with the thinking of others. People have been thinking about these issues already. But of course also to draw some interest and appetite for the report. So the report, we just started working on it. That should be out in October of this year. So I hope to be back by then here to present the real findings of the report. What you now get is a sneak preview of the issues and some of the issues that we think are the messages that we think we'll get out of the report. Just to put things into context, when you think of climate change from the perspective of food insecurity, well, our projections so far is something we'll update also shortly, but our projection, if you take demographic trends, population increases, growing urbanization, and other trends, food production will have to increase by at least 60% around the world to have enough food for everybody to eat. What we also know from our existing assessments is that we've pretty much reached the land frontier and other natural resource limits to produce or to increase food production. Which means is that most of this increase in food production will have to come from yield increases, intensification from the existing natural resources. And that we need to do even without accounting for climate change, which we haven't done in this picture yet. So I'll come back to that. But basically it means we have to find ways to deal with climate change in connection with food security, that we still need to increase food production, but making sure we do less, at the same time, put less pressure on natural resources, land, water, and so on. We also know from the IPCC reports and many other studies that food availability will be affected by climate change and is already affected. I'm not sure how well you can see this graph. This is a little bit of a fuzzy picture because the blue bars show where climate change is expected to make a positive impact on yields. And the yellow bars or the orange bars are the ones where we expect negative impacts. So if we look at the impact in the medium run, so up to 2030, it more or less evens out. We see some crops improving because of climate change, global warming improves the productivity of some types of produce, but that's mainly concentrated in areas with temperate climates. And then there's negative impacts through droughts and more floods and so on and so forth, which particularly impact and are already impacting in large parts of Africa, Asia, and also Latin America, where we see more of the negative impact. So on average, we're good, but it's like this effect of, on average, you're good, but having your feet in the fire and your head in the refrigerator, right? So that's how you can feel about this. And so we could say for global food security, in principle, we could say, well, we the negative impacts on average may not be so bad, but in certain parts of the world we see major threats in food availability from climate change, and we should expect that. If we look further into the future, up to the end of the century, then we see the negative impacts only increasing if climate change is not abated. We also expect it to have major impacts on the access to food, not just because of less incomes through the less food production, impact on food prices if we get more volatile because of more volatile weather, more volatile food prices, that typically tends to affect the most vulnerable populations first, and so may get increase in food insecurity for that reason. It may also affect food utilization for the same reason. Incomes decrease, particularly among the poor that may be affected. That may have impacts on the nutritional quality of foods, but also on some of the crops that may be directly impacted on by climate change may reduce the quality of food intake by many people. The World Bank recently did a study called Shock Waves with a number of scenario analysis how much poverty impact there could be. Of course, it's model based and it's projections into the future, but have two different scenarios. If the world can manage to deal with the poverty problem, they call it the prosperity scenario, then maybe poverty may go down, but if we start factoring in the impacts of climate change, then that will go up. But that impact would be much less on that scenario than the impact of climate change on the scenario where we wouldn't get that extra effort on reducing poverty, and then under the high impact climate change scenario, we could get almost a tenfold increase of poverty impact increase from climate change. So the upshot of that story is first that probably poverty reduction and climate change adaptation have to go hand in hand. For our work, agriculture is main part of that story. And also to look at the same World Bank study, if this works. So if you decompose the impacts on poverty and the origin, the source of these impacts, take the poverty scenario, which shows it most clearly, it's mostly agriculture that's driving the poverty impacts from climate change. And that's because, well, agriculture is so sensitive to climate change more in general. Okay, so that's one thing to take account of. So adaptation, poverty reduction, food security probably have to go hand in hand. I'll come back to that in a minute. Then, of course, as you may know, agriculture is a major contributor to the drivers of global warming, of climate change, of greenhouse gas emissions. According to our database, agriculture, forestry, and other deforestation, other land use is contributing about 1/4 of the global greenhouse gas emissions. It's going down, the share is going down a little bit, in part because of more efficient use of resources. But that's the smaller impact. The share is going down because other sectors that contribute to climate change, like energy and transportation, are increasing more strongly. So we see a declining trend, but on the total, if you look at the total emissions, the decline is rather marginal from agriculture. Which means also mitigation efforts to a large extent will have to rely on what agriculture does with itself and how we change food systems and agricultural systems around. But we also do see the sources of climate change, also degrees of contributions of emissions, varies quite a bit around the world. We see big impacts in the Americas, particularly from the deforestation effects, but also from crop production. In Asia, it's particularly crop production. Rice cultivation by itself is contributing 19% of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions in Asia. And whereas also the capacity for forest to act as a sink CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions is very different across regions, very little in Africa and Asia, and larger in the Americas. So our solution also have to look at these different patterns and as causes as well as the consequences of climate change. So, in a nutshell, as I think it's attributed to an American baseball player, Yogi Berra, said, "The future ain't what it used to be." I think that also applies to agriculture. The agriculture's future cannot be what it used to be because we need to change agriculture around. To ensure environmental sustainability, and with it sustainability, food security, as much as that we also need agriculture to contribute to reductions in the causes of the sources of global warming and hence climate change. Now we also know is that whatever we can do in mitigation efforts and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, it will take a pretty long time before we see the effects in stopping, halting climate change. Well, in the meantime, we have already the impacts from increased droughts and more intensified other natural shocks and effects on particularly agriculture production. So we need to look at immediate resilience and adaptation efforts as much as we need to look at what can be done about the mitigation potential for the longer term effects. Now, one of the storylines we expect to make in the SOFA report 2016 is that maybe for agriculture it's not so relevant to make this strong distinction between adaptation and mitigation efforts. The two have to go together, and I'll come to that in a minute. What it also means that what I talked about before about the required increases in agriculture production, the intensification to get to the required levels of increases in food production, we have to come through what we call sustainable intensification. And how to do that and how these transformations can be adopted and these new technologies and practices can be adopted, that will be a core part of the report. So here are the key questions that we'll raise in the report. What's so special about climate change in agriculture? Well, some of that speaks to itself. It's agriculture is 100% dependent on natural resources for production. It's a very complex system because not one crop is different from the other, and so on and so forth. As already mentioned, the key question is, can we achieve sufficient sustainable intensification? How can we make adaptation and mitigation move together? And then one key concern, of course, is that most agricultural producers, food producers around the world, are smallholder farmers. So we estimate near 500 million of them. So how would they adapt to those new conditions, and what is their capacity to adapt and improve their resilience, and what are the strategies moving forward? And then we'll address them, if we put that all together, what are the implications for agriculture investments, global finance, and also the governance, and how governments should work together and other stakeholders in securing food security in the longer run. Since I have only a couple more minutes, but maybe part of the storyline will strongly center around how to make agriculture more climate smart. Has been a pretty politically sensitive term, also in our discussions with member states. Sometimes because climate smart agriculture is thought through as it's just about mitigation. So how can agriculture contribute to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? But the term was invented to build on making agriculture less sensitive to climate shocks and making it sustainable. So we use other terms as well, but that's how we should think of it. It's as climate smart agriculture. So it's about improving the resilience of agrosystems as well as socioeconomic systems. As I showed in the presentation on social protection, if people can manage their risks better, then also they don't engage in also climate risky strategies to survive. It's about improving carbon and nitrogen management in agriculture, but we have to look at the broader value chains as well, particularly also on the consumption side. We also know the dietary transitions that we see around the world with increasing incomes, increasing urbanization, that's pushing a lot more demand for animal protein, that's putting a lot more pressure on natural resources, water, and so on, in part because animals eat plants first and then we eat the animals, and so there's much more pressure on land use and natural resources on the whole. So how can we improve that? Now, the way to put these things together, what we use as a framework for the report is what we call the principles of sustainable food and agriculture, which is about resilience building, which can have both positive impacts on adaptation through better economic stability at the household level and less risky livelihood responses, as well as through that have a lower impact on greenhouse gas emissions. Later, that's about the broader improvements in livelihoods and reducing inequalities in agriculture and rural sectors, about resource use efficiency, the protection of resources, particularly to create greater sinks to help climate change mitigation, as well as for enhancing adaptation strategies. And it's about institutions and having enough finance to make the transitions towards these more sustainable ways of production. Okay, then it will be a long story about smallholder farmers, which I don't have time to get into, so I'll skip that. And just focus on where we want to end up in the governance, say, well, how would the strategies look like when we target the support of food producers in order to get this large scale scaling up of sustainable agricultural practices? What are the types of technological diffusion that would be needed, and what other factors need to be put in place? What scope and what role should it be for collective action, producer organizations to overcome access to technologies, and also for lack of economies of scale, or should we move to different agricultural production systems altogether? Risk management strategies, including social protection, will be part of the story, and how to make sure is that the climate change action is fully integrated into agricultural development strategies. Then it's very important to look at the consumption side, very difficult issues, how can influence consumption, but if we don't push from both sides, from the user end, from the producer end, we may not get there timely to make the necessary action to make food security sustainable over time. And then, since climate change is a global public bad, we will need a lot of international cooperation to make this happen through finance and through technology transfer in order to make this happen. So these are the broad issues of the report. We hope that we can influence also the policy processes. The COP21 outcome has all the elements to do what the report proposes to do, but what needs to be done is to define more concretely the feasible pathways for sustainable food security and agriculture. So let me stop here and look forward to your questions and comments.